Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. It was on May the 9th, 1950 at 6 p.m. that the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundations for the European house, where today some 500 million Europeans live together in peace and cooperation. I call this the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched a European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. Now, today we have as our guests two of the editorial staff of Vista Journal, Jim Memory, who's actually the editor, and he's coordinated for the Lausanne movement in Europe as well. And Evert van der Pol, who works closely with us in the Schuman Center as a senior researcher, is a professor at the Evangelical Theological Seminary or faculty in Heverlee, Leuven in Belgium. And they're no strangers to Schuman Talks. They've been with us here before. And I want to ask them why European voters are moving further right. So welcome, Jim. Welcome, Evert, to our talk this month. And I should just explain to our viewers that we send this out on the 9th day of each month at 6 p.m. In order to make people more aware of the significance of that date, May the 9th, 1950, when at 6 p.m. Robert Schuman gave this talk that, in my understanding, actually started a very significant movement towards European cooperation. And it was part of a much larger international order that came about after the Second World War, with major Christian impulse making it happen. And this is what's being threatened right now directly threatened by President Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, not just 2 years ago, but actually 10 years ago, when he first made his move on the Crimea. And this is he's been testing the waters concerning this international order, and this is being threatened right now. And so I'm very grateful that you two can join me today to discuss this question. And so let's see the background to this question. Is a report that came out recently, if we see this next question, from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and says that the upcoming European Parliament elections, which will be June the 6th to the 9th, will see a major shift to the right in many countries, with populist radical right parties gaining votes and seats across the EU, and centre-left and Green parties losing votes and seats. So what's behind this expected sharp right turn, as it's being called? Is it the issues of migration, the agricultural policies? We're seeing farmers turning out in their tractors, blocking central squares in numerous European countries. Is it the financial hard times? Is it all has to do with Russian disinformation? What is your take on this? I would say disturbing possibility looming on the horizon. I'd like to start with you, Jim.
Okay, well, first off, it's great to be with you again, Jeff, and the privilege of today is to be able to share something in this session. I found a book a few years ago, which I think is still useful to help us to understand what's going on, and that was Eatwell and Goodwin's book, National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. And that identifies four trends, which he calls the 4Ds. And I think we can see those behind what we're seeing in Europe at the minute. The first D is distrust. The large number of European citizens in many countries that no longer trust their politicians. They feel alienated from the national conversation. And in the case of the EU, even more distant from that. They don't feel represented. They see the political class as elitist and disinterested in the problems of real people. And I think we can kind of see that a little bit even in the way that the Brexit slogan, "Take back control," was found by many to be so compelling. That distrust and the need to get back our sovereignty that's been ceded to others. So that first D around distrust. The second is destruction, and that is the destruction or the perception that national cultures are being destroyed. That may be because of mass migration, but even in countries where migration is relatively low, people perceive that their culture is under threat. And far-right populists argue that neoliberal political and economic structures are damaging the nation by encouraging further immigration and changing the way that things have been. Where what I know is being destroyed, and certainly as we know, the illiberal democracy of Viktor Orban in Hungary is a reaction to that, to the perceived destruction of culture. The third D is deprivation, which in some ways is an extension of that second one of destruction, because it's not only destruction of culture, but also of, to some degree, the economic privilege that the people within the country have had. Things are not as good as they used to be. Of course, there have always been inequalities of income, but those differences seem to be exacerbated in Europe today. The rich are super rich, the poor are super poor, and the sense of losing out to others is there in the background, I think, as well. And then lastly, so we've had distrust, destruction, deprivation, and the last D is de-alignment, where the weakening of mainstream political parties with stable blocks of voters, that's gone. It is relatively frequently now we see large historic political parties almost disappearing and being taken over by completely new parties, both to right and left. New parties emerging in nations like Spain. Until a few years ago, there was no meaningful far right party, and since 2014, the Vox party has become very significant factor. And of course, the abandoning of centre-right parties like Mark Rutte's VVD in the Netherlands for Geert Wilders' Freedom Party. So those would be that would be my starting place. Those 4 Ds I personally find very helpful as a kind of opening gambit. I'm sure Evert would amplify and extend or possibly challenge that. He always enters into a good conversation with me about such things.
So, Jim, you're actually, you are a Brit, but you've spent a lot of your life in Spain as a missionary there.
That's correct.
And Evert, you're a Dutchman who has spent a lot of your life in France. And actually, when I have asked you, do you consider yourself Dutch, French, or European? And you've said unequivocally French. And yeah, so this is just to help our listeners see where you both are coming from and the breadth of experience you have in Europe.
Yeah, so just to finish that on that point, then before Evert comes in, I can't say I'm unequivocally British. Neither will I say I'm unequivocally Spanish. And since I have an Irish passport, and thanks to that, I'm still an EU citizen, I'm certainly not unequivocally Irish. So, but I would say I'm pretty European, whether that's with a capital E and an EU flag waving over my shoulder. I'm not an uncritical European, but do consider myself to be a citizen of Europe.
Yeah, and in your role as co-convener of Lausanne Europe, you are looking across Europe, plus as editor of Vista Journal, which is looking at Europe. I should say this about Vista. It's really the leading Christian journal, evangelical Christian journal, that's really trying to grapple with understanding the true situation in Europe today in order to inform the mission community. And so that all gives you a European perspective as well. Evert, what would your take on all this be?
Um, well, the reasons that you quote in your introductory questions, all these reasons are valid, and we can read all the comments on that in the newspapers and in other journals. It's a bit a combination of all that. Um, what I think is happening is that the original vision is vanishing. The original vision of nations in Europe um, ending their warfare and starting to collaborate for the common good to create prosperity and peace in our continent. That was the original vision, but people have forgotten that. And I think the EU is perceived by many people not as something of us, European nations, but as an instrument of globalization
Mm,
through endless free trade. And people are suffering from that and don't understand where their place is in this globalizing world, and for whom the EU really is fighting. Are they fighting for us, or are they opening the economic borders for a competition that we cannot keep up with? And so many people in Europe feel they are losing the game in the globalization process. They are losing. And they don't feel that the European Union is defending their interests. That is the perception. I don't say it's true, but it's the perception.
Mm.
And this perception is shared by a growing number of voters.
mm,
Now, the question is, if you are dissatisfied with how the EU is functioning, why turn to the left? Why not turn to the left? Why turn to the right? Uh, is the left pro European? Is the right anti European? That is a very strange thing. In the radical left, traditionally, there was much apprehension about Europe.
Mm.
The left did not join the Schuman call in the 1950s. It was
mm,
the Christian Democrats.
mm,
And the Social Democrats, who were more center left, they joined. But the project of Europe was uh, not defended by the left as it was then. Um, their vision was internationalist, and they saw the European Union or integration as something of the right. And so the whole perception has changed. Within the left, you still have some voices who are quite anti European, but more by and large, they would use the European Union for their agenda. So the only option left now for the voters is the far left, because the center parties have identified with the European cause. So I think that is happening. I agree with the 4 points that Jim has put forward. That's of course. But when we talk about the mistrust, which is really a fact, there's a mistrust towards the political leadership of left and right and center, those who have governed alternatively our countries for the last 30, 40 years. There's a mistrust. But uh, who is capable of listening to that mistrust, or to whom do people turn when they mistrust people? They only seem to have the option of the far right, and I think that is a pity. But in the political offers that are offered to the people, there are not many alternatives, except for some very radical leftist parties, but who do not gain a hearing.
Mm.
And as long as the leading political establishment um, still defends the, the current policy of the European Union, people don't have another choice. If they don't trust that, well, then there is only one choice left for us. That doesn't mean that all these voters share the radical views of these politicians, but in the in the political supermarket, that's the only product they seem to be able to buy, but they are not always aware of what they are buying.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this then. How do you perceive the EU responding to voter frustrations? My second main question. Um, how are they just ignoring it? Do they just consider it to be unreasonable? Yeah, what's been the response? And continue, Evert. You were talking about the
Yeah,
EU because you've been closest to the fire there.
I'm surprised by the way politicians have two discourses. Within their own country, the political leadership seems to listen to the grudges and the complaints of the people. And so they say, yes, we have to protect our agriculture. Yes, we have to protect our industry. Yes, we have to protect our borders. Yes, we have to get a grip on immigration flows. Yes, we have to do that. Yes, we have to do that. But as soon as they go to Brussels or to Strasbourg or whatever place, they convene with their other leaders, and it doesn't seem to work out the same way there. And so, what are they really saying? We do not see the European Union acting very strongly because the European Communion is committed to free trade. It has committed itself through free trade agreements to open markets that cause competition within our countries. And so, in my country, in France, agricultures cannot live from the product of their fields because the imports from other countries outside the European Union are so cheap, they can't compete with that. But we haven't seen the European Union as a union taking measures already against it. So I think there is a lagging behind. National politicians are facing protest in their country, but they don't seem to be able to translate that in concrete action in the short term on the European level. And this feeds in with the mistrust people have, and people say, well, what are they doing there in Brussels? They're not defending our interests. And so they take to Brussels with their protest. But people don't understand that Brussels is us. It's us together. It's not a strange power somewhere. It's us together. So politicians seem to have a trouble translating the national unease into concrete measures on a European level. That is my perception.
Now, some commentators are saying the failure is not too much Europe or too little Europe, that there's a kind of a soft nationalism, is the term being used, on behalf of the governments who still, with an eye to the protesters, are trying to safeguard their nation. Once Mark Rutte from the Netherlands, he went to Brussels and said, I'm going with 3 agenda items, Nederland, Nederland, Nederland. But of course, when he gets into Brussels, he's Mr. Europe. So is that paradoxically opening the door for a much more radical nationalism when the solution might be in another direction?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think my perception of the time I lived in Spain was that Spanish people would be very enthusiastic about Europe, but whenever there was a problem, it was very easy to say, well, in Spain we do this, and in Europe they do that, and very quickly to blame the EU for all the problems. And the politicians would go to Europe with a very, as you just said with Mark Rutte, would go to Europe saying they were going to be defending their country, but when they're in Brussels, things switch around and they come across as being part of that European elite, and their peoples then say, well, what did you say when you've come back with nothing that's of benefit to us? I think one of the lessons from the Brexit campaign is that politicians don't always have a good sense of the frustration of their peoples. They're often isolated from that. And certainly in the years in the UK leading up to the Brexit vote, the Tory party, the right party, tried to ignore the far right initially, then to ridicule it, then to buy it off with concessions, but ultimately ended up adopting its worldview in order to survive. And that kind of tendency, I think you could potentially see within the EU as well. We don't quite know what to do with the far right, but they've ended up affecting the language and the way in which the debate is framed. And I think it's important to say it's not just the older generation here. If everybody who voted in November's Dutch election had been aged under 35, Geert Wilders would have got even more votes than he did. And in the French presidential runoff, significant percentage of young people, 39% of the under 24s and 49% of the 25 to 34-year-olds voted for Marine Le Pen. This is not just about the older generation. Young people who tend to be more pro-immigration are living precarious lives now. I read an interview with a young Dutch voter who said this: "I voted for Wilders and many of my friends did too. I don't want to live with my parents forever. I want my own home and to be able to provide for my family later on. Wilders wants to figure out the housing crisis and make our healthcare better." Now, the promises might be simplistic, the far right promises, but those are real world frustrations. And it's very easy for us to dismiss the reasons why people vote for the far right, but they are in some ways are a reflection of the fact that most politicians are not really listening. Most centrist politicians are so in their bubble, they're not hearing the real difficulties that not just young people, but many people in Europe are having right now.
Now, how much is this based on? Yeah, you go ahead,
I should add an element because what Jim says that is very true. That is very true. But what is intriguing is why politicians who are part of the population are so unable, apparently, to listen to the frustration of their compatriots. They're intelligent people. They read the newspapers. They listen to television broadcasts, so they should know. I think an element that has to be kept in mind is that the same politicians who listen to the frustrations of the people, or who try to, at any rate, they also have to listen to voices that many people in the street don't listen to, but that is in the international arena of agreements, of negotiations. And these voices are completely different. And so for politicians to make decisions, it's very, very complicated because they have to take into account voices that the man in the street doesn't appreciate, but the politician has to. There are international agreements, there are trade agreements, there are political agreements, there are agreements on immigration, there are a whole bunch of collective directives of the European Union that have been put in place. Now, the man in the street can say, well, I don't care, but the politician who represents me, he has to care because he sits in the meeting in Brussels or in Strasbourg or in Washington or whatever, and there are binding agreements, they have been decided upon, and you can't turn them away overnight. So perhaps politicians do listen to it, but they are listening to voices that the man in the street is not always listening to.
Mm-hmm. And that's really true for the politicians in power, but the would-be power mongers, they can easily make promises, but they haven't had to balance the books yet. And of course, we're facing that in Holland right now with negotiations for a government that we can see no end to, simply because of unrealistic promises.
Yeah.
Now, there's
another aspect. Protest parties, they have the luxury of having no commitment to treaties and to international structures, not yet. As soon as they get in, well, they will discover.
Yeah, and so will the voter.
And the voters. Yeah.
So it's a very fickle kind of a vote right now, and this adds to the element of instability for the foreseeable future. And Jim, you talked about people who what they know is being destroyed. And I think in England, particularly with the Brexit vote, the language of somewheres and anywheres came up. That is, people who live somewhere and who are very much invested in their location, but others who could live anywhere, and they're much more cosmopolitan, more the city dwellers. There's quite a difference between these two, and just the somewheres who feel that their known location is being invaded by foreigners, and everything is changing, and they are feeling unsettled by the dislocation.
Yeah.
Would you see this happening across Europe as well?
Yeah, I do, and I tend to take it right down to the very simplest of examples. I'm getting an echo now. Are you hearing an echo?
David, it might have to do with your earphones. I don't know if you perhaps is picking up a signal from your earphones now that you've taken them off.
No, I don't have any earphones in. So
no, Evert did. Yeah.
Oh, Evert, okay.
I
if we imagine a pensioner in a little village in England, an old lady, she's 75 years old. For the last 10 years, she's gone down every Thursday to pick up her pension. And one Thursday, she goes into the shop, and suddenly there are 5 big black men from Nigeria. Okay. She's terrified at this situation that suddenly into her calm and ordered world have come men from overseas that she never anticipated or had any say in them being there. They've been sent by Westminster, who've distributed the asylum seekers across the country into locations so that they're not all in London. But she had no say in that. Is she racist for feeling scared? Should we really criticize her for feeling unsettled by the world that's changed without her having had any part in it? And I think it's easy to tar people with the racist language unfairly. The effect of globalization has been enormous, and it's impacted everybody's lives in ways that we cannot possibly summarize in a podcast like this. But I do think people are unsettled right now, and they hear promises from the far right. They hear simple solutions. They don't want measured, nice sounding words. They want answers to their real problems, and somebody who can make sense of what's happening in the world. And so, I often think of that old lady because I think it helps to make it real.
Yeah, and there really is something to do with the populist use of scapegoating. It's very easy to simply scapegoat, and it's Brussels or it's the foreigners and so forth. Yet,
it's the racist old women,
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
We can easily dismiss it, but there is something real happening that we need to sit up and take notice of. Let's ask then the question, where are the Christians in all of this? Are the Christians showing a tolerant, open attitude? Well, you've just described somebody who could be a Christian. I sometimes wonder if and when all these Christians get to heaven, they think they've turned up in the wrong place because there are all these foreigners there.
Yeah.
And we have to face it. The biblical scenario includes people from every nation, every race. We need to get ready for the idea that the church ultimately is cosmopolitan, and yet we haven't always experienced that. So where do we see Christians in the midst of all of this? Evert, do you have a contribution here?
I think by and large, Christians are attached to what Christianity has brought in their country and in their lives, and they don't want to see that disappear. Christians vote for all parties, but currently I think that the European Union is perceived as an instrument to push for a liberal cultural agenda that is moving away from the values and the norms that Christianity has brought us and have been part of our society. And that makes many Christians apprehensive about the European institutions. Mm-hmm. The European Court of Human Rights is a case in point. It pronounces judgments that many Christians are very uneasy about. And the phenomenon of secularist intolerance towards Christian conscience in matters of sexuality, abortion, life issues, but even wearing religiously connoted dress, etc., is making people with faith, not only Christians by the way, but also Muslims and Jews, more and more apprehensive of these European institutions that, in their view, are advancing a cultural liberal agenda with which they do not feel comfortable. And so, as long as the political establishment does not speak out on that, then the political offer is not very large. So people are voting for parties that seem to defend what they cherish. I say seem to defend because the right-wing parties that say they defend the Christian values or the Christian character of our culture, in their personal lifestyles are not so very Christian at all. So it remains to be seen whether they really do that. But the perception is there. And behind that perception is an unease with the political establishment. We had a few days ago a vote in the French Parliament, the Senate and the National Assembly combined, to inscribe the right or not the freedom to abortion in the Constitution. That is the first country to do so. Now, the church and all the other religious institutions have expressed their concerns for years now, but the government is determined and was determined to push that agenda and putting in jeopardy the liberty of conscience of medical staff who do not want to commit an abortion or to collaborate in that. And so this is a very serious thing. And the Roman Catholic Church, but also the Islamic representatives, the evangelicals, the Jewish community have expressed their concerns, but there's no way to be heard. This agenda is being pushed, and the French government has committed itself to promoting this within Europe and putting pressure on other countries to inscribe this right in their constitution as well. Now, you imagine the average Christian, he's concerned. He has expressed his concern. He wants to have a more pro-life advocacy. He doesn't hear his voice being represented. Now, whom do you turn to? Whom do you turn to? This is a great problem. Yeah. The Christian Democratic parties have almost vanished from the scene in many countries. So these parties are no longer able to make their voice heard in the political arena. And that leaves many Christian voters orphans in the political scene.
Yeah, I think you said that very well, Evert. if we if we use the language of push and pull, people feel pushed out by their by the liberal secular debate. Christian people feel pushed out. We're not welcome here.
Yeah.
And where do I go? Where do I go then if I'm not welcome in this space? Well, over on the right, there are those whose messaging pulls them in that direction.
Yeah.
So they're being pushed out, disenfranchised, becoming orphans of the center ground. And on the right are those who will say that they are defenders of Christian Europe, that wrap themselves up in Christian language and symbolism, and are very willing to make the simple conclusion that Christian Europe is being taken over by multiculturalism or Islam or wokeism or liberal social values or whatever. Many far-right politicians make great use of Christianity as an identity marker, as a way of talking about us and them. And that establishing of an us and an other is very dangerous for us as Christians. We'll come on to talking a bit more about this in a second, I'm sure, but the church is called to be a community for us and the other. There's no way we can avoid that. Christ has called us to welcome all, and that's something which we cannot renounce. We cannot fall into the trap of allowing ourselves to be turned into an us and be part of those who are othering those who are here from other places.
Well, that's a good bridge to the fourth question I was wanting to ask you, and you've already started to answer that, and that is, where should Christians position themselves? How can biblical imperatives guide us through these issues? Perhaps, Evert, you might want to speak to this.
Yeah, there are two lines within the Christian message that seem to contradict, but the two are necessary. The first line is the universal line. God loves every human person. Every human person is created in his image. So this Christian universalism obliges us to love our neighbor, whoever he is, wherever he comes from. That is the first line. But secondly, humanity lives in families, in tribal or people families, and that is what we call nations today. There is a sort of a medium level where people associate or are associated and organized together. And people are attached to that. People groups have a history, people have experience, people speak a language, people understand each other, they live in the same place, they have the same challenges. And that is what we call nations today. It is a very complex language, but you can't deny that people feel attached to a certain group of people to whom they belong. Mm-hmm. And that is not just an administrative thing. A nation is the group of people where I pay taxes to a government or a state, but it also has a history. People have their stories. People are living in a certain place which has shaped their lives and their histories. And so, over and against a cosmopolitan view of the world, where all these differences are seen as irrelevant and you can live anywhere, whatever you want, I don't think that works. And in the Bible, it does not work either. There are nations, and the Bible talks about God allowing each nation to live in a certain place. And you shouldn't cross the border of your neighboring people group. And there are people groups collaborating, working together, but that doesn't take away their peculiarities and their languages and their differences. And so the vision of the apocalypse of all the nations and languages being before the throne is exactly this diversity that is represented. We are not going to speak one language. We're not going to be one nation. No, there are all the nations, in their peculiarity, with all the languages and their cultures and their peculiarities. And I think that the universalist human rights discourse today is ignoring that. And the leftist, elitist, the center-left elite, is ignoring that too much. And people are, this is going against the grind of the people. And so in the past, the Christian democratic tradition in the political arena, in the democracies, has always given room for a national expression. They were called people's parties, and they were very much aware of the peculiar and the specific nature of the people, and that is what people associate with. And it is not by erasing these differences for a sort of larger European or cosmopolitan or universal identity, but it is in collaborating within this diversity where each people can speak its language and can express himself in his own language and can identify with the people around him in his country. Mm-hmm. And so this patriotism, which is a positive form of nationalism, has always been part of the Christian discourse. In the Middle Ages, it was represented by the image of the body of Christ, having many members, and in the Corpus Christianum of the Christian world, every people group was a member of this greater corpus and speaking his own language and having its own history. And in Europe, every people group has a relation with Christianity, but it is a different one. The Polish relation with Christianity is quite different from the French relation with Christianity, not to speak of the Dutch relation or the Scottish or the Swedish. So every nation has a national memory of Christianity, which is not the same. And this diversity has a place within Christianity. So Christianity is ideally equipped to preach a universal message and giving a place for the particular story of a person and a people group. And so I think we should recapture these two elements of Christianity today, which is saying that the Christian faith is not on one side or the other, but it is on both sides. Mm. And so instead of saying, well, the far right is bad, so we are going to be with the human rights groups, I think we should escape from this simple solution. We can identify with both, and Christianity has always done. Mm-hmm. And so we should not be tempted to take positions, but to give a universal message in the nationalist groups and to give a positive nation message among the universalists and the cosmopolitans who want to erase all the references to our Christian past. And that has always been Christianity. We have had both.
And ideally, this is reflected in the EU motto of unity with diversity.
Yeah, exactly.
The devil's in the details. And we are seeing elections coming up in June for the European Parliament. How should Christians approach those elections?
Well, I'm just going to build a little bit on what...
Bit unfair to ask you now that you've been forced to step out. You won't be voting yourself in those elections. But
no, that's right, I won't.
Well, as an Irishman, perhaps you can...
No, because I'm resident in the UK now, so I don't get to vote. So I can say what I like, can't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just building a little bit on what Evert has just said. I think what that highlights is the desperate need for much deeper theological reflection around the nation and its place in God's purposes. When was the last time you heard a sermon on anything like that? It's not taught in our churches, and so therefore it tends to be politicians who get to make the argument of what this is about. And I think Evert's put it very well. So we need to recover a biblical understanding of the place of the church and the nation and how those things interact with one another In the case of the church, our identity requires an overriding loyalty to Christ. That's the starting point. Our primary loyalty is to him, not to our nation. At times, that means that we will be free to celebrate and affirm aspects of our culture, and we should do that, as Evert has rightly said. We should be celebrating the community where we live, where we are settled, contributing to the prosperity of the city, praying for our neighbours, praying for our town and our country, for that is the community where God has placed us. But at other times, we must challenge and separate ourselves from that culture and critique it. And a failure to make a distinction between our loyalty to Christ and our loyalty to our nation can lead us down the path that we know where it ends. We've had that in our history when where the church has basically baptized the nation and led us down a deadly path.
Yeah.
But we need to be in the public sphere, in the public space, critiquing our societies, and not just the far right, but right across the spectrum. So to my point of view, the liberal elites also desperately need us to be critiquing them as well. The centre ground politicians who are often just playing the numbers, and to my mind, the church must take a much more active role in politics generally, and particularly in regards to their community and their nation. We have a task to do, and that task is to preach the gospel. But part of the way that we do that also is by engaging politically in the spaces where we live. And I think the church has an opportunity in these elections to engage in debate. And I would encourage people not just to vote, but also to think about how they can encourage their churches to be wrestling with the issues, their organizations to be considering what the implications are of the different parties and what they're encouraging us to do, but to remember that we're called to be a people for the us and the other, and that universal and particular dimension is vitally important right now, given the tensions that there are in society.
Now, we're talking Europe here, but of course, I think we're all very conscious that all these issues are hugely relevant for America right now, facing their elections. And you've already started to address the next question. What does this all have to do with the Missio Dei of the church in Europe? Perhaps, Evert, could you explain that term, Missio Dei, a missiological term, and say, now, okay, what we're talking about, is this a kind of a sideline from the main task of the body of Christ, or is this a central aspect of what we pray for when we pray the Lord's Prayer for his kingdom to come here in Europe as it is in heaven?
Yeah, Missio Dei is a Latin term. You've introduced it, Jeff, into our conversation. It surprises me a little bit, but okay, Missio Dei, the mission of God. The reason why in missiology this term is used is that it expresses the fact that the mission of the church is not an end in itself, but it is grounded in the mission that God has given himself to save the world from the consequences of sin and to establish reconciliation and life and peace and righteousness in this world. And we are called to participate in this mission, and we are part of, as Christians, we are part of this mission of God. And God also uses non-Christians. He uses the structures of society. He uses the structures of family, of association, of government, of education, of culture, of art, all these spheres of society, they participate in a way also in God's plan to not abandon the world, but to save the world from the consequences of sin, as far as that is possible in this time and age before the return of Jesus Christ, when the kingdom of God will be established in a definite way. And so it relativizes the mission of the church in saying that we are participating in a much wider mission, namely the mission of God, in which also the Jewish people has its part to play through its history as well. And on the other hand, it broadens our vision that our mission is broader than communicating the message of the gospel. Of course, that is a key element of our mission, but it doesn't stop there. The mission of God extends to all spheres of society. And so we are commissioned to be present in all spheres of society, not only to communicate the message, but also to live it out in our lifestyle, in the decisions we make in everyday life, in our businesses, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in the way we eat and dress and behave and take part in discussions, etc. And also to structure it. And this brings me to an important point that has often been forgotten. Today's world, the public sphere seems to consist of, on the one hand, a bunch of individuals, and on the other hand, the state. And the political parties, they ask us to vote for them. What we have left out of sight, which has always been a very critical and important part of the Christian democratic view of society, is what we call the middle ground, the civil society of associations, of schools, of businesses, of family structures, of neighborhood, of sports, of media, of culture. They are neither individualist, neither the state. And in the Christian view, the state is one of the spheres, but it does not dominate all of it. The church is one of the spheres, but it does not dominate all of it. We have also other ways to associate, and this middle ground has been weakened in the recent decades. People are individuals who make choices, but our commitment to these intermediate structures has been weakened, and that explains a lot of the problems today. So a Christian vision is not only to engage with the political debate, but also to think through what is our place in all these intermediate structures, and how can we strengthen these structures? How can we strengthen family structures, which are so important for people's lives? Larger families, extended families, associations. And I think perhaps an example of is also the structures to welcome strangers, to welcome orphans, to welcome migrants, to welcome people in need. The church has always created these structures. They have been taken over by the state, and now people look to the state to arrange for that. But historically, Christians have done that themselves. And so I don't see any reason why not to reinvent and to re-enter this area and to support all these intermediate structures. That is a bit besides the political vote that we have to cast, but that is only a little part. When we talk about the societies in Europe, there is a huge middle ground of society where we have a responsibility, and we have a rich history to draw from, because we've been doing that for ages and ages and ages. And so my challenge would be to learn a bit from that forgotten history, and to take back this middle ground and to engage in all kinds of social, ecological, humanitarian activities, and not think that the state should solve all these problems.
Mm. Very good.
So what I hear here is that we, as God's people, need to wake up to our responsibility, not just to be engaged with church activities, but actually be shaping by our prayers and by our actions the kind of future Europe we want and what we think God would want. And so let me close our time together, unless with an invitation. But I don't know, Jim, if you have any closing thoughts.
I've just got a couple of quick thoughts to finish off with, okay? Because for me, the thing that Missio Dei does, firstly, is it takes us away from an ecclesiocentric, a church-centered idea of mission, to have our heads up to what God is doing beyond our church, beyond our vision of how God works. And there's no question that in the case of Europe, the biggest thing that's happened in the last 50 years from the perspective of the church is the arrival of millions and millions of majority world Christians into Europe, not mobilized by mission agencies as you and I were, Jeff, in our day, but by the Spirit of God, bringing them here to renew our churches, to give us an example of what discipleship of suffering really looks like, with their vibrant spirituality, their zeal for evangelism. That is something that I think is part of what God's mission is about in the world today, and in Europe specifically, and is a reason for us to not just avoid talking about the issues that we've been mentioning today, but to actually engage with all of this and say, look, God is doing something here. We cannot afford just to be an ethnic European church. We must look at how we integrate and help these new arrivals to be part of the European church going forward. But the second thing that I think I just want to add around the Missio Dei is the Missio Dei reminds us that this is God's mission first and foremost. He's in control, and this current situation, however difficult it might be, you mentioned the American elections, there have been much worse situations in human history and in the history of the church than the present one. And through all these crises, God has brought his people. And we know how this story ends, and it ends with the Lamb upon the throne and God reigning forever and ever, as Evert reminded us earlier. So the message of the kingdom of God relativizes completely the place of the nation and even the place of the church in God's mission, and puts us in the right place to be thinking about how we vote with confidence and with hope, and wanting to transform our society in the way that Evert has said. So I think that's a hopeful way of ending.
Yes, and before I extend my invitation to our listeners, tell us, Jim, about Vista, and how can people subscribe to Vista, and what are you trying to do through Vista? Because Evert's also a regular contributor, part of the editorial staff, and you've got some other very key people on your staff.
Yeah, so very briefly, Vista was launched in 2010 with the vision of trying to help busy church leaders and mission leaders who had an interest in mission in Europe to have good research-based articles to help them to think through those key issues. And what we've tried to do is to adopt a very straightforward approach to each issue. We look at a given topic from a number of different perspectives. And in fact, the very first issue of Vista had the topic of nationalism in Europe. We had half a dozen articles, and that's pretty much the way that we've gone, taking on different issues, whether that is church planting or whether that is young people's ministry, whether it is the issues like the border policy, or what's happening with creation care in Europe, or drug or people trafficking. We've covered dozens and dozens of issues. We're into our 45th issue now, and the team is working hard on this next issue, which will focus in on nationalism in Europe again, with a view to bringing in some new perspectives. We have one of our editorial board who is a Malawian theologian, and his perspective from an African view is always fascinating to read because it throws new light on the topics that we're going to be looking at. So the new website, everybody can get access to all the past issues. It's completely free, and you can subscribe on the website so that you receive it by email whenever the new issues come out.
Thank you, Jim. And you said earlier, when was the last time we heard sermons on this topic? Where can we go to get perspective on these issues from a Christian point of view? And I would like to say that Evert is involved he runs a theological course in Haverley, the Evangelical Theological Faculty, with degree programs. We as the Schuman Center partner with Mission College in a master's degree program of European studies as well. And we'll put up here websites where you can find more information. Jim, what courses are you involved in still?
Yeah, so the old Redcliffe modules have been rewritten for delivery, and we'll be doing that for the first time next month through All Nations College in the UK. So I can again give you access to
Here
that.
comes the website of that. And all right, thank you very much, Evert and Jim. I'm going to close now with an invitation, and that is for you all to join us in Brussels on the State of Europe Forum, May the 9th, May the 10th and 11th. It's close to May the 9th. May the 9th, of course, is Europe Day. This year is going to be also Ascension Day. And so May the 10th is a Friday evening through the whole day on Saturday, the 11th. We'll be meeting in Brussels at the Carmelite Church along the theme of Wake Up to Reality, Europe. There are so many levels on which we as God's people, but we as Europe, need to wake up to new realities that are staring us in the face. And we'll be joined there by the Anglican Bishop in Europe, Right Reverend Robert Innes, as well as the former Prime Minister of Slovakia, Ed Hagen, and other people who have been engaged in praying and working towards God's kingdom coming in greater measure in Europe. And we invite you to join us there. Actually, on the 9th, we're going to be having a European Study Day in the Chapel of Europe, where we look at how the gospel, how the Christian faith has really made Europe Europe, and how the whole process of European integration was midwifed by those operating out of their Christian understanding. And so we invite you to join there. We're going to be walking through Brussels on the morning of May the 9th, a walk through the European Quarter as well. And for further information about this, you can read this week's Weekly Word. There at the bottom, you see weeklyword.eu, where I'm telling more about what's going to be happening there. So you're all welcome to join us there in Brussels. So we're going to sign off here. And again, thank you, Evert. Thank you, Jim, for joining us on this very important topic.
Pleasure.